Hello and welcome to this Spotlight event. My name is Inez Sharp. I am the editor-in-chief of Spotlight magazine. For those of you who don't know our products, we create English language learning content, a magazine, an audio product, an exercise booklet, in what we hope is up-to-date English, and we hope that it's useful and informative for our readers. Before we begin with the event, I'd like to make you aware that there's a chat function in which you can send us any questions in English or in German that you might have, and we'll be answering those questions at the end of the interview. Now, like any magazine, Spotlight has regular correspondents, and this evening it's my great pleasure to introduce you to one of them. Lorraine Mallinder has been writing for us since 2009 and has covered mainly society and travel topics. Most recently, she's written a log for us about a trip that she took to Iraq to research stories for the BBC and the Irish Times. We'll be talking about that later. But first, welcome, Lorraine.
Hello, Inez, and hello, Spotlight readers.
Lorraine, can I begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I think probably the main thing that comes to mind is I come from a mixed background. I grew up largely in Scotland and spent a lot of my teenage years in Mauritius. So so it was a multilingual upbringing. I grew up speaking English, but in Mauritius also French and Creole, which led me to then go on and study languages. So I'd say that, I started out as a linguist. I studied interpreting and translation, and initially worked in that field. For a couple of years, I taught interpreting and translation at a university before making the switch to journalism.
And so why did you decide to become a journalist? What brought that on?
Well, I think it was something that it wasn't like something. Often when journalists are asked that question, they say, "Well, I wanted to become a journalist from the age of 6, and I was working on the school newspaper, the university newspaper." That wasn't necessarily the case for me. I think it was more of a feeling of something I wanted. And there's a very famous quote by a guy called Henry Luce. He was the founder of Time magazine, and he said, I became something like, I became a journalist so I could come closer to the heart of the world. And I think that quote really encapsulates a feeling that I had from a young age about wanting to be in the thick of things and wanting to get to the truth of things, wanting to peel back the layers and find out what's really going on here. And really, yeah, just feeling like you're doing something that matters. So I think that was the feeling that drove me.
Because somewhere in the log, you say somebody called you a Lorraine of the 10,000 questions. So you clearly like researching and finding out about things, and that's certainly part of being a journalist. Can you remember your first big story, Lorraine?
Now, I started out working in Brussels, and initially I was specialised in EU politics. And that, I did write stories that, they did kind of attract attention and did make a bit of a splash. But I'd say the first important story I wrote was after I moved to Canada. I moved to Canada after a few years working in Brussels. So I moved to Canada in 2008. And I remember arriving and just, started kind of reading the newspapers, finding out what was going on in the country. And one of the stories that caught my eye was a commission of inquiry into what's called the residential school system in Canada. And it was a system that existed for, about 150 years, from the late 19th century or so, an assimilation system for native children who were ripped from their homes across Canada and sent hundreds or thousands of miles away to these church-run schools. And there was a lot of physical, mental, sexual abuse that went on. Untold numbers of kids died of tuberculosis in the filthy, cold conditions. And a lot of kids never found their way back home. And I read that. And at the time, it wasn't an international story. It wasn't really something people knew about Canada. Canada is always seen as the kind of the Boy Scout country, you know, as like the country as kind of people leading the fight for the good, yeah, and people don't really see that side of Canada. And I remember I pitched the story to the BBC, to to Radio 4, and they were immediately interested. And from there on, I did that story and then carried on following it up, and it became one of my major things when I was in Canada. And it was after that that the story started attracting more attention, and now it's well known. The Canadian government has actually admitted that it was a genocide. What happened was genocide, but this took a number of years. And when I first started reporting on it, yeah, it was still fairly. People didn't think this commission of inquiry was really going to do very much. People were very cynical about it, and it kind of snowballed, and it became something bigger.
You must be proud of that.
Well, it was I think it was more the kind of, the opportunity. So happy to have had the opportunity to have arrived in the country at that time and to have been on the reservations talking to a lot of native communities. I started with the Mohawks. I made a lot of really strong ties with a lot of Mohawk people who trusted me with their stories, and it was so glad to have had the opportunity to tell that story.
Okay.
Mm.
So what motivates you? Because a lot of your stories are human interest, makes it sound a little bit less dramatic, but these are stories about people.
Yeah, I think definitely the aspect of, because when I say that I started out in Brussels, and I was doing a lot of stories I was writing were about trade, economics, finance, industry, and always kind of dealing with the institutions in Brussels, and a certain kind of a type of I guess the kind of the fauna of Brussels, lawyers and diplomats and academics and lobbyists. And I got to a point where I thought, I want to write about people. I want to write about real people, and that was one of the motivating factors. At the time, my eldest daughter was then 7. And I thought, where can I go with Tess? Where can we go and live to kind of explore this, and for her to kind of also benefit from the experience. And we settled upon Montreal. She was being schooled in French in Brussels. We could go to Montreal. She could carry on going to school in French. And to me, it was a great white north.
Okay.
Let's go there.
Okay, fabulous. How do you set up a press trip? How do you establish contacts? I mean, you talk about, if you're having a pitch, and once you get there, you need a fixer. I love that. I love that term. But how do you get started?
Yeah, starting the ball rolling is always the hardest part, because you start with an idea. It's just an idea. You have to then make that reality. Especially if it's not a story that's in the, particularly in the news. It's something you got wind of, or something you want to explore, and you're alone in it. Yes. Then that can be kind of quite daunting to start off with. But I always find you start reading, you start kind of, you ingest vast amounts of information before you go anywhere. So you're reading news articles, you're listening to podcasts, you're watching documentaries, you're probably reading a couple of books. You're reaching out to people. There are always, with the types of stories I write, certain actors, you'll have people working for NGOs, aid agencies. You might have people in think tanks. You'll have people on the ground, activists or diplomats. So you start kind of reaching out to people. Sometimes it's not that successful, because doing things from far away is quite difficult. But you start with 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, and that can inevitably lead to more. But it's kind of taking that first step.
Okay.
And getting the fixer sorted as well.
Yes, I'm fascinated by this idea of the fixer. I need a fixer in my life as well. But I mean, I'm assuming that person, I mean, how do you make contact to that person? Who recommends you a fixer? Because it's not just a question of them getting information for you. They're doing a lot of things for you. And you mentioned also they're looking after your safety to a certain extent. and probably need to be aware of their own safety as well. So it's not just anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And generally, word of mouth, you get recommendations from other journalists. Sometimes, sometimes you wind up working with people it doesn't work out as well, or you
Okay.
sense it's not going to work out. Sometimes you're very lucky. My favorite fixer in Guinea-Bissau, someone I've done quite a few stories with in West Africa. We met quite by chance. We met quite by chance. He was actually a journalist over there. Sometimes local journalists will offer their services as fixers as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, in the current issue of Spotlight, we have a log that you wrote for us about a recent trip to Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit about the trip?
Well, it was a funny one because it wasn't a typical trip because I hadn't been away for quite a long time because of the pandemic, like everybody else. I was living in lockdown land, and it was the first opportunity that I'd had to go away again, and that was just in August, last August. It was strange because it had been the first time in quite a long time. Obviously nervous anytime you go away somewhere anyway. But yeah, quite kind of like nervous and didn't know how it was going to go. Very happy to get away at the same time. But while I was over there, I think the COVID thing was definitely, the COVID rates were skyrocketing next door in Iran. And in that sense, I had to kind of perhaps be a lot more careful than I would be normally. Where normally I go somewhere and I'm all over the place.
Okay.
And there, I had to, really kind of manage things properly and logistically, just kind of ensure that, you're not kind of passing on and you're not kind of, you're not catching it as well. It's really kind of that was. It was a peculiar one, yeah. But I'm very fond of Iraq and the part of Iraq I was in Kurdistan in the north. It was just great to be back there again.
Okay. You wrote about the city of Erbil, and it seems to be like a kind of have an almost Parisian flair. That there are these great patisseries and there was this wild nightlife, and it's not something we associate with Kurdistan, to be honest.
No, it's really because there's this image of Kurdistan. Well, there's an image of Iraq first of all, and
Yeah.
people don't differentiate between Kurdistan and Iraq. So that's the first thing. And it's true when you're in Kurdistan, the Kurds really have kind of they've built something. I guess you see it mostly in Erbil, which is quite developed in the center. And like you say, people kind of, you've got places you can go out for a drink, you've got quite kind of nice cafes, and you can go and get your cappuccino or your macchiato. So it's kind of different in that sense. But at the same time, it's a very difficult life there still. It's a part of Iraq that is controlled by ruling clans with their interests and their kind of own patronage networks. And if you're in the patronage network or you're a member of the ruling clan, then great. If you're not in there, life can be very difficult. And, that helps to explain why we've seen quite a big exodus of people from Kurdistan in recent times. I don't know if you heard there was there are a lot of Kurds who've ended up in Belarus.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A crisis going on at the moment. So they've gone to Belarus and they're trying to get into Europe, and there's a whole story behind that. But also there was an accident in the Channel.
Yes.
Just at the beginning of the week, 27 died. An absolute tragedy, and quite a few. A lot of people in there were from Iran, Afghanistan, and Kurdistan, and a lot of people trying to get out of Kurdistan as well. It can be quite, it's even if your life is not in immediate danger, your chances of advancing in life are are non-existent. There's a lot of oppression and there's a lot of it's very difficult to get on in life and to make enough to live on. So a lot of people trying to get out and get away from that.
You say that in the log, you say that you have a certain affinity to the Kurds. You're a Scot, you're a proud Scot. And if you say to a Kurd, you're an Iraqi, that they're a bit insulted, in the same way as if you say to a Scot, you're English, or maybe
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Or even if you say you're British, some Scots will not have it. Yeah.
Okay. Are you generally drawn to report in areas where there are minorities, or is this just more of a coincidence in
I
this
think
case?
it's more of a coincidence. Because I'm very kind of, when it comes to my own, in terms of nationalisms, in terms of, is that what you mean when you talk about minorities?
Yes, yeah.
I think I'm very kind of, when it comes to my own kind of background, quite ambivalent. But yeah, I'm always interested in, but whether it's the Kurds or people from the rump of Iraq, I'm
Yeah.
interested. I'm interested. It's out there. It's in these parts of the world where we we don't really kind of understand, that we don't really understand necessarily, that we don't really know that much about, where
Yeah.
there are stereotypes. And I'm interested in kind of going and, like I said before, peeling
Yeah.
back the layers and finding out what's going on.
One story that you've been peeling the layers back on is a really tragic story about Yazidi women. That was the main focus, or one of the focuses, for your trip to Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit about the background to that?
Yeah, well, that is, yeah. I mean, it's a real scandal, actually. The story of the Yazidi women, which was attracting a lot of international attention. Back in 2014, there were over 6,000 Yazidi women who were taken captive and who were effectively enslaved by Islamic State and used as sex slaves by Islamic State. And years on, I mean, it's been, since Islamic State was finally defeated in that part of the world in 2019, in Baghouz in Syria. A lot of these women are still unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to them, and we're talking about, close to 3,000. Rights groups believe, from the evidence that they have, that a lot of these women are still alive, and a lot of them are still either with Islamic State members who are still kind of, who are out there in the sleeper cells, or in other countries, or possibly at a detention camp in Syria called Al-Hol, so imprisoned with the ISIS brides. So this is absolute scandal. Were there an international effort to do something about this, and to actually, set in motion a process to identify these women who are still living in a state of, they're still thoroughly oppressed, brainwashed, under a lot of psychological pressure. Even if they're in a detention camp with, which is being run by the Kurds in Syria, if they were to identify themselves, you're essentially signing your death warrant. There will be consequences. There will be repercussions. People are too scared to speak out. So a lot of women trapped there. Rights groups think that hundreds of women are actually imprisoned with the ISIS members in Syria. So it's an absolute scandal. Actually, this is still happening.
You travel to countries like Iraq and Pakistan and Cameroon, places that most of us would think of as unsafe. Have you ever felt in danger yourself?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, like, first of all, nerves, fear, anyone going. I mean, you'd have to be fairly kind of numb to not feel, or stupid not to feel any fear before going anywhere. So that's the first thing. Feeling in danger, you do kind of, I think you do develop, the more you kind of go places, you do kind of develop some sort of sixth sense. But everything you do is a bit of a calculated risk. You're not just jumping in there head first. You're kind of going. You're kind of assessing. You're planning. If you want to kind of do this kind of work, you should probably do what's called a hostile environments course. So I've done one
Okay.
of those courses where you're working with, in my case, it was former British Special Forces. So you're kind of given some days training in, how to defend yourself, how to, you go through a kidnap simulation, these types of things, to kind of, you learn a lot of tips, you learn first aid, emergency first aid. You also kind of learn a lot of tips, just, simple things like if you're going anywhere, to always be sure that your contacts know where you are, and that you're
Okay.
always you're sending geolocations to someone who will be able to kind of, follow up if anything happens. So you need to take precautions. It's a calculated risk.
Okay. What do your family and friends think?
Well, I think that I have two daughters, and the eldest daughter loves it. She's like, she
She thinks it's cool.
She thinks it's fantastic. But the younger one is not into it. She's like, I don't like you doing that job. And she's always suggesting other jobs to me. But friends and family generally, to be honest with you, I mean, I think people might say, yeah, well, Lorraine, like she does this stuff, like, but I don't really kind of talk about it that much necessarily either. When I'm with my family and friends, you kind of talk about other things that are going on in your life, or that are going on in their lives. I think it's necessary and probably a good thing not to have, for you just to kind of keep a separate, your sense of self, your
Yes.
identity, not to have it too enmeshed.
I understand.
With
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Any interesting people that you've met along the way? I mean, in the log there are some great sounding people. The businessman, the Iraqi American businessman, Lorraine. Just tell us about some of these people that you meet as part of your work.
But you meet all sorts of people, and that's one of the things that I love, and I think like that drive me in this job is just the sheer variety of people that you meet. But you'll meet people that, for example, in Pakistan, I remember one woman really kind of struck by this woman, Fatima, who works with slaves, modern day slaves, who are forced to work in these brick kiln factories around Lahore, and who's doing this single-handedly, going in kind of like setting up these rescue missions, working to free as many people who are cradle to grave. They're stuck working in these factories, and whose whole life is dedicated to that, and whose life is constantly in danger, who's constantly receiving death threats, and no one there kind of recognizing or applauding or in any way giving any kind of like recognition for what she's doing. And someone like that, I find is just absolutely kind of it's just astounding. People like that you meet, just incredible people. And then you meet other people, you meet all sorts. So I mean, one thing that comes to mind is I was in Liberia in 2017 to cover the elections there, and one of the candidates who went on to win was George Weah. The national footballer. He's considered one of the best footballers to have ever come out of Africa. He used to play for AC Milan and Chelsea and Man City. And I remember everyone was trying to get an interview with George Weah, and no one could get an interview with him. I followed him through the bush. I almost got stuck in the bush on the muddy the muddy tracks, like car almost got stuck. And he still wouldn't talk to me. And one day I woke up, I was like, what the hell am I doing here? If I don't get to talk to George Weah, if I don't get to interview George Weah, why am I here? And I just decided to go to his house. I went to his house and stood outside his house and started talking to the guys at the gate. I was like, okay, well, let's see what happens. And next minute, this cavalcade turned up, and the gates open, the cars go into the courtyard, and this guy just jumps out of a car, pulls me in, sits me down, gets George Weah. Okay, George Weah was like, okay, shoot.
Oh my gosh. But you had something to write with or something to record with. And
my pad and my pen with me. Definitely, I was armed with my pad and my pen. Okay. And luckily I had my camera as well. But he was like, yeah, God. And it was almost like I wasn't, suddenly I had this opportunity to talk to him. I had to kind of think quite fast. Okay, what am I going to ask him now? But stuff like that. But you absolutely, just couldn't make up.
No.
All stuff like that always happens. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do you have certain things with you when you travel? Always? Is there, something, I don't know, something, some little object that's always there, or there's something that you always think you're going to need, or how do you pack, and what's in your bag?
Yeah, always the same things. It's almost like a kind of, yeah, it's just such a routine. Like you always have your laptop, always have your recorder, my Zoom recorder, always have, which I got for the work that I do with Spotlight,
Hmm.
and very handy. And so I always have that with me. I always have my camera. I bring notepads with me. I always have a few notepads because you get to wherever it is your destination. It will inevitably be the most difficult thing to find a decent notepad. So I bring them with me too. Couple of credit cards, your documents, and actually not that many clothes.
Okay.
Like I'll have a couple of outfits which I'll just wash. I'll wear
Well,
alternate days. They'll be drying in the hotel room. I really like to kind of keep it to a bare minimum.
okay.
What I take with me. My bag is so small. People are
Okay.
always astounded. That's all you bring with you.
Okay. And what about sort of rituals? Do you have any particular rituals, something that you always do? You come into your hotel room and say, right, okay, I'm going to put that down there or whatever, or is it always different every time?
Oh no, total ritual. Like everything has to be organized. Clothes have to immediately go where they're going to live. You're going to put all your kind of equipment in another place. If you've got your recorder and stuff like that, I always kind of make sure, I place things out so I know if anything's been kind of played with or anything. So I always kind of set things up. My documents will always be kind of, I'll have a book with me inevitably. I'll have a book there,
Right.
but I'll put my kind of documents in there. And just kind of, yeah, generally that is when I'm leaving the hotel room as well. I'll make sure well, I always leave the hotel room. I think that's kind of general kind of rule of thumb. Anyone should kind of follow. You kind of leave your hotel room in a decent
Right.
state for people who are going to come in and clean after you. But always make sure make the bed, get everything laid out before I start packing again. That way you don't forget anything. And
Okay.
yeah, I mean, and generally speaking, all the notes that I ever take on the same day, get them out the notepad and into the laptop, type them up. And
However
then,
tired you are.
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What do you notice when you come home? So you've been in Iraq for a week, or you've been in Pakistan or somewhere else, and you come home. I mean, there must always be a little bit of a shock or a little bit of a changed view of Britain or wherever it is you're landing.
I think it's always like a sense of, coming back, and it's almost like a kind of novelty when you see, you can go to the supermarket and you can get all this stuff, and taking a pleasure in kind of finding ingredients to cook something, sit with the girls, have a meal. That's the kind of stuff I usually kind of really enjoy coming
Right.
back, and and
Okay.
and just enjoying the life that I have with the girls. It's always and things always, because you're coming back from somewhere so different. There's always that kind of novelty factor of, we are so lucky where we live in this
Okay.
world, and just kind of enjoying being with the family.
Okay. What would you say to a young reporter starting out? Somebody says, "Okay, I want to be a journalist." What three things would you tell them?
Well, I think like definitely, yeah, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions.
Okay.
It's a really, it's a really good. I started off in Brussels. Brussels was a EU land, full of like press releases, briefings, full of like Euro jargon, impenetrable, opaque, very difficult to understand a lot of the time, and probably a lot of the time kind of deliberately difficult to understand what's happening and what's actually being said. And I really learned a lot, I think, from watching. Some really good reporters there at the time.
Mhm.
People like David Gow at the Guardian. There were really kind of great journalists from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I remember also from yeah, I mean papers around the world that are congregated there. But you generally notice that these journalists, the questions that they're not afraid to ask, the stupid
Right.
questions.
Okay, so
Um,
one is ask the stupid question.
Yes, so that's number one. Yeah, I had it was funny, like a friend of my big daughter's, my eldest daughter, who wants to become a journalist, and she said to me, "Well, how do you cope though? Like, what's it like? Is it not really uncomfortable being a journalist in foreign countries, and you're asking these questions, and you're getting involved in their business? do you not feel uncomfortable? That's what she wanted to do. And she had this kind of hang up, a kind of complex about seeming kind of overly intrusive, this kind of foreigner coming in and
Yes.
being intrusive. And the tip that I gave to her was really just to kind of treat everyone with respect. I think that kind of comes through. If you treat people with respect, whether they be the lady coming and cleaning, or the man coming and cleaning your hotel room, or the prime minister or president of the country, but you treat everybody with respect and the dignity that they deserve. And I think that comes through, and people then kind of just take you as you are. Absolutely. So I think that's a really important one.
Okay. Okay. Is there a book that you have on your bedside table, a life of a reporter or a collection of reports from a particular journalist? Is there somebody you admire that you would say, I go back to that book and read that again and again, or 2 journalists or 3 journalists? Is there somebody who really speaks to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've read like quite a lot of books by journalists that I've appreciated, but I think the ones that really kind of spoke to me and really kind of, I think, kind of tapped into that feeling I was talking about earlier on, about wanting to get close to the heart of the world. And there are a couple of writers. One of them, I don't know if you've ever heard of Robin Davidson. She's an Australian writer. So it's more in the order of female explorer.
She's the one who walked across big parts of Australia, or had a camel with her. Yeah.
It's 4 camels.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was a really big one for me. Just her sense of truth, and the passion with which she was doing it, and her honesty, and I really loved that book. And another one she wrote, Desert Places, going through the desert and the border between Pakistan and India. So it really spoke to me. Another one is a Belgian writer called Lieve Joris.
Mm-hmm.
And she wrote, she's written a number of books, and one of them really struck me. It was The Gates of Damascus, and it came out sometime in the mid-90s. And she's going, and again, it's not so much a journalistic thing as an exploratory thing. She's going there, and she's talking to people. She's meeting families. She's meeting women, and just finding out, what is life like over there, and how are people living. And there's definitely kind of a sense of kind of a pervasive sense of paranoia and fear running through that book, with the secret police in Syria, and that really kind of like struck me. So those writers, who I think of them as explorers, really.
Okay. What stories are you looking to cover in the coming year, 2022, Lorraine?
Well, fingers crossed,
Okay.
because everything that's going on right now, a lot of what I'd like to do is kind of go back to stories.
Okay.
So I'm particularly, I'd love to go back to Pakistan and look at the impact of what's happened in Afghanistan, and with the return of the Taliban to power, and the impact that's having on Pakistan. Anything that's happening in Afghanistan is going to be spillover in Pakistan. I'd like to go to Peshawar, near the border with Afghanistan, and do something on that. I'd also like to return to Hungary. Hungary are having elections in April. Viktor Orban of the Fidesz party will be seeking a 4th term. It's a story I've covered in the past. I've gone quite in depth on this one, particularly on the government's takeover of the media, of the free press, and how the free press has been kind of decimated in Hungary, and generally the corruption, the cronyism, this model of illiberal democracy. So that's something I'd like to kind of go back to as well, and quite a few others. And stories in the UK as well. I've always got, I'm always kind of thinking, cogitating,
Okay. What do you do to unwind?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Because I think that there are different parts of my life, and one of them is work, and the other is the kids, and life with family and friends,
Right.
And I think that one kind of, when I'm away working, it's almost like a rest.
Right.
From being mum. And when I'm being mum, it's a rest from working. So, kind of one provides kind of some sort of, relief from the other. So I think, that there's a sense of balance in there. But other than that, I really like painting. I love painting, so that's something when I get the chance to do. It's not that much, and cooking as well. I'm a big fan of
Well,
cooking.
you're also a cookery author as well, and provide wonderful recipes and great background for our food stories. So yes, I get
Thank you.
that. Let me just see if any questions have come in, because I think we're slowly getting towards the end of the interview. So I'm just looking out to our. Okay. I can't hear it. Ah, yes, there is something coming in.
Luca would like to know, do journalists get psychological support when they work on particularly difficult stories?
Can you hear that, Lorraine? So one of our readers, one of our listeners, Luca, wants to know if you get psychological support as a journalist.
Probably not really. To be honest with you, when you're working as a freelancer, you really are on your own. You really are. I think your support mainly comes from your colleagues, probably. Being kind of, being in close contact with your colleagues, talking to your colleague, people who can relate to, if you have things that you want to get off your chest that you can talk to freely. So that's probably that's probably it. I would say that as a freelancer, there's not so much of that on offer. Even if you're a staff journalist, I think it's now that a lot of organisations have kind of woken up to this, to the need to provide support for journalists. Yeah,
that would make sense. Do we have any other questions, Owen?
M. Marie would like to know what is a fixer, and how does she manage only to deal with trustworthy and honest people?
Okay, so we have a question about the fixer. M. Marie, I think is the name, and she'd like to know what is a fixer exactly, and how can you be sure that they're trustworthy?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. So what is a fixer exactly? So the fixer is the person when you go and work somewhere, and particularly if you don't, either you don't know the place or you don't speak the language. That's a really kind of, that will, if you can find a fixer who can also be your translator, then that's fantastic. But the fixer is basically someone who knows what's happening on the ground, someone who may be a journalist in that country, who knows how to get to the stories, who has all the contacts, who can set you up in direct contact with the people you need to talk to as quickly as possible. And they really act as, there's Inez, you mentioned the security aspect of it. And in some ways, yes, they are acting as your eyes, your ears. They know the country, they know the risks well, they know what they're dealing with, and to some extent your security will depend on them as well, which is why it's important, if you have a fixer, to make sure that you pay your fixer properly what they deserve, and also that you're careful not to kind of like to get them in any situations either, because it might be difficult, the working conditions might be difficult where they are, so you don't want them to get into trouble either for what they're doing.
And have you ever come across an untrustworthy fixer, somebody who's,
I've come across fixers who, I remember one fixer, and this is my first fixer in Liberia, and I actually didn't continue working with them because every idea I was coming up with about what I wanted to do, for example, to interview George Weah, he would basically be like, nah, that is absolutely going to be impossible. You're not going to be able to do that. Forget it. And wanted to work with someone and say, no, it will be possible. I'm going to make it happen.
and
so
you
yeah,
did.
and I did, and in the end, I did it on my own. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Well, Klaus asked, what's the most unusual thing Lorraine's ever eaten on one of her trips?
So Klaus wants to know, what's the most unusual thing that you've ever eaten on one of your trips? You didn't eat the goat's head.
No.
That's in the log for those of you who are interested. But
The most unusual thing, now there I would struggle come up. I'm kind of racking my brain.
Because you're not a vegetarian.
I'm not a vegetarian. For example, I have been at a market like in Liberia, and this market was just it was in the middle of a downpour, and yeah, the place was just swimming in mud, and it was all kind of like tarpaulin kind of stalls, and the place was just sinking basically. And I remember stopping at a stall, and some meat of, yeah, I mean, that I couldn't even kind of describe, what kind of meat it was. But I was so hungry. I got this meat and ate it. And gosh, like, I could have, to this day, I'm not sure what that was, but I was so hungry, I went for it.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
Is there a story that Lorraine worked on that she really, really loved the most? Is there a favourite story?
Do you have a favourite story? Is there a story that you've worked on that is just, your absolute favourite, just closest to your heart?
Well, I think that definitely the residential school story that I spoke about earlier was one that was very, very, something that I really cared about, and something that I still care about, and something that I'd like to kind of follow up on in future as well. But that was something where I knew it. For as soon as I kind of read about it, I arrived, and kind of as soon as I read about it, I knew this was something that, it was almost like being kind of pulled by an invisible cord. I knew I had to go there, and I had to investigate this. And then another part of the world that was very, it's very perhaps a series of stories that I did. Was in Gambia. Mm-hmm. This was in 2016. I don't know if you're aware, there was a dictatorship in Gambia. A guy in power for but 22 years, Yahya Jammeh. Mm-hmm. And I went to Gambia to kind of cover the elections, where it was predicted that possibly he might be toppled, that the opposition had actually managed to get it together to mount a proper fight in the election. And that was like just from beginning to end. And I went there twice because the Yahya Jammeh lost the election, and he kind of lost gracefully, and he was about to step down, and then he changed his mind. And he said, I'm staying actually, and you can do what you want, but I'm in the presidential palace and I'm never leaving, and just plunged the country into crisis. And I went back there to kind of cover that. And at one point, the surrounding countries were actually threatening to come in. Nigeria was threatening to come in. With to send its military in to yank him out, and eventually he had to leave. And I think those two trips to Gambia were so vivid. I'd arrived there just as the election results were being announced. I'd actually travelled on election day. I thought, I'm going to get there. The election result will be out. Probably there won't even be a story if he's won again. I got to the airport, not a soul in sight, because all the staff were like huddled in these rooms waiting for the results. Okay. Out onto the airport concourse, and heard some very faint clapping, quickly kind of died down again. I was like, what just happened there? Did he win? It could be anything. And there was a strange kind of silence, and suddenly this woman shouted out, "He's gone!" And the place just erupted. From nowhere, just the clapping, the cheering. I went out onto the street. I got a taxi to the hotel. The streets were full of people dancing. I have never felt such euphoria in a place as I felt in Gambia. I've never witnessed such mass euphoria. It was a moment of pure happiness, pure joy. And then there was the story was such a roller coaster, because the dictator, Yahya Jammeh, had lost, and then he decided he wasn't leaving, and, the crisis. So the real roller coaster of a story. Everything about that was just, in my mind, I think it's one of those things that I'll carry with me, one of those experiences that I'll carry with me, definitely.
Okay. So that's a very good experience. But sometimes I think in part of the log that you wrote, there are also moments. One of the people that you interviewed said, "Why can't people come together to change things?" This is in Iraq. Why isn't the international media writing about this? So sometimes, you know, you are there, you're talking to people, and yet they are frustrated. They know that probably nothing will happen. How is that?
Yeah, that is something where you feel, you know, you question, what am I doing here? How am I doing it? How much can you possibly do? How much can you possibly? And the thing is, I don't think that some people, you know, I think, you know, some people do have a kind of sense of, you know, a lot of journalists have a sense of, I want to go out and I want to kind of change the world. I think for me, it's more, I don't like injustice. I don't like injustice. And if I see an injustice, someone's being done an injustice, either as an individual or a group of people, and it's just wrong, I want to kind of like, whatever happens, I want to write about it. And I want to kind of, in some way, be part of that, you know, that story coming out, other people reading it. Doesn't matter, you know, could be like, you know, 5 people reading it. It could be like, you know, it could be thousands of people, but you just want to take that and put it out there. So it's not happening in silence. It's not happening in a silo. Yeah. And one thing that really, I mean, one story that I'd like to go back there is Cameroon, where there's a conflict happening, and it's been bubbling away now for a few years in the Anglophone region of Cameroon, in Western Cameroon, on the border with Nigeria. And you know, the English speakers in Cameroon who have been, and there's a lot of kind of, you know, who have felt oppressed by the mainly francophone government and military. And it's a very ferocious battle. I mean, both sides, there's a lot of brutality. That was a situation where you went and you know that you're going to a country where the guy in power there, Paul Biya, has been in power for nearly 40 years. Wow. He has a lock on this country. Yeah, it's a very strictly controlled country. And you know you're going in there, you finally managed to make it through. But how much you're going to tell people what's going on, but then what? And essentially, I've come back, and a few people have reported on it, but it's still going on, and it doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. And yeah, that I think is something. Yeah, the frustration that people have talking to you, thinking, why should I believe it's going to change anything? I don't think that's the point. That it's necessarily. It's more telling the story. I think telling the story is the primary focus. There's an injustice, you want to talk about it and tell people.
Okay. Lorraine, we're going to leave you to continue getting to the heart of the world, the heart of things. Thank you very much for taking part in the interview. There's an article about the Yazidi women that Lorraine told us about in issue 1 of Spotlight 1 2022. Magazine comes out on the 15th of December. But for now, I'd like to say a big thank you to Lorraine for taking the time to talk to us, and to you everybody for joining us. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for listening.